Welcome to That'll Preach. We've got Wyatt Graham, Executive Director of the Davenant Institute, on with us today, and excited for this conversation. I follow Wyatt's work for some time now, and what I appreciate is not only is he spearheading the Davenant Institute's desire to retrieve Protestant theology, but he's doing so as a Baptist, which is something I appreciate and something that I'm curious about. And glad to have you on the show, talking here with us, Wyatt.
Yeah, well, I'm thankful to be here and to meet you virtually and talk about things I think that we mutually appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a couple, a lot of the interviews I have on this podcast, I'm like, they're just questions that I'm interested in, it's sort of like a selfish endeavor in that respect. And, something I've been kind of thinking through is, there's this big movement in sort of Reformed evangelical circles to, like I was saying, retrieve theology that the Reformers assumed, Trinitarianism, Doctrine of God, all these types of things. And I've greatly benefited from that work, and a lot of Davenant has been a part of that. But one thing that's always stuck in my mind is, can a Baptist do that? Can somebody who holds the credo baptism do that? Because, you're holding to something that the vast majority of the tradition doesn't hold. And so I'm curious, just your own personal story. How did you get interested in the project of Protestant retrieval, just from your background as an evangelical, as somebody who holds to credo baptism?
Yeah, it's almost probably two origin stories. One is a teenager being given works from reformational authors, Puritans, I guess, and others, who, and then eventually guys like John Calvin, who sort of opened my eyes to like a bigger world out there, a bigger world in my local context, a bigger world of differences, a bigger world of different ways of putting theology, a bigger world of maybe disagreeing with where I was at theologically, that gave me an appetite to know beyond my own corridors. And I think there's a weird reality in which we live where we are both highly connected across the internet. And yet sometimes, even despite the fact that we have all this information at our hand, we become more intellectually isolated than ever before, either through just talking to people like you or finding groups that are just like you. And you're almost not pressured to find people who are different because it's easy to talk in, let's say, an echo chamber. Or when you hear differences, you kind of just view them as anomalies or whatever. Probably the second origin story that is maybe a bit more direct is in my low 20s. I was mentored by a guy who was an expert in the Apostolic Fathers. And I think for a summer, we read them together in Greek. And he opened my eyes to the joy and fun and discovery of who are these early Christians that are right in front of the Bible. At this time, I had studied behind the Bible, namely history. What's the historical Old Testament background, New Testament background, Roman, Mesopotamian, etc. And pretty much everywhere I went, we were encouraged to study behind the text, namely the history, to give you insight in the text that was in front of you. But I came to realize, well, there's probably something incredibly valuable about reading some of those who are part of the original audiences, not the original letters, but the original, like the group, right? The early Romans, the early Greeks. And then, it opens your eyes to different idiom, different language, the Didache, for example, talk about the Lord's Supper as the Eucharistia, the Eucharist. And then you begin to realize, it's because Paul says we give thanks, which is Eucharistio, like the verb. It's actually a biblical word. And, in the Baptist world, Eucharist is a Catholic word, but then you find it's actually a Bible word. And early Christians were just, were doing things like that. So there's an origin story there that I think got me deeply interested in the past. And then it was one of those things that I think because I had access to this early, that I never really lost the itch to know beyond my own corridors. Part of this had to do with maybe an insufficient theological grounding in the churches that I grew up in. Not that they were like bad or terrible, but being a curious person, the questions weren't answered that were like big. Like questions like annihilationism, questions like election predestination, questions that I think a lot of people ask when they're not just in a very comfortable form of Christianity. They're very curious, universalism, all that kind of stuff. And I think the past has access to 2,000 years of people that the Spirit has indwelled and led to equip and grow the church that Jesus Christ promised to build, that the gates of Hades has not overcome. And it would be incredibly strange for me not to access the gifts that God has crowned to edify and build up his church. So that's the origin and a little bit of my personal biography of why I find the past so useful to reflect on.
Those early church fathers, especially, it's kind of like being transported into a different world. Some of the things they're thinking about, and it can be kind of jarring when you first dive into them. And I'm just thinking about the past 15, 20 years. You think about the young restless reform movement, and it was like this explosion of Calvin's theology. People were retrieving, his soteriology, and it becomes popularized on a mass level. And then I remember in 2016, it was that whole EFS controversy, and I was like, what are people even talking about here? And that sort of opened things up to the history of the church. And you're hearing about the Cappadocian Fathers, and you're hearing about, the other things that Augustine wrote, and you're hearing about, Athanasius and all these figures. And I remember feeling like it was a little bit overwhelming. And so when you think about Protestant retrieval, how do you think of that in like a more bite-sized way? Like, how would you explain that to your average lay person? What we're trying to do, and what are things that we're trying to recapture from this massive, timeline of history?
That's a good question. So there's almost two questions. Like, how do you simplify it, understand? The second one is kind of what we're doing retrieval. Let me answer the first first. I think when you look back over 2,000 years about things that Christians did and how they act and how they worshipped, one thing you discover is that there's a common denominator throughout. There's different practices here and there, but there's common denominators, which is essentially who God and who Christ is. So God, Trinity, Christ, our Redeemer. That gives you a sort of interesting weight to your faith. You know what virtually all Christians at all time emphasize as the most important things are: who God is, who the Father, Son, and Spirit are, who Christ our Redeemer is, who came for us and for our salvation, and what it means to be the church formed by God and Christ. So I think that that's a really just simple answer. It gives you some weight, it gives you stability, because you mentioned a couple things, YRR, which really emphasized Young Restless Reform, which really emphasized Calvin's soteriology, election, predestination, and so on. And those things are interesting, but they're not really the weight of Christianity across time. They're important, don't mishear me. But you can, let's say, not be too deep into predestination theory, and you'll be completely fine. Like, it's not going to harm you at all. Augustine, for example, in his book on predestination, or was it on one of the ones, Perseverance or Predestination, just says, be really careful how you teach this, because it can get really weird. People can get freaked out. Like, just be gentle on these things. I would go with that. You mentioned EFS, eternal functional subordination, an incorrect view about the Trinity. Well, that kind of stuff you can get really into, but you kind of realize we've got 2,000 years where this stuff's really been handled and rejected. It shouldn't freak you out anymore when this stuff comes up. It happens all the time. So the big picture is, to simplify it, is you look in the past, what have Christians really focused on? And that helps you to know what to focus on. It just gives you clarity in your faith. Christians have always cared about the Trinity, always cared about Christ and how Christ saves us and makes us the body of Christ, the church, redeemed saints, etc. All the other stuff that is incredibly interesting beyond that is incredibly interesting, but is maybe in the orbit of centrality at the second, third, fourth, fifth tier. The second part of your question is like, what is retrieval? That's a more complicated question. So people talk about retrieval in all sorts of ways. I mean, obviously it means going back to the past. Some people are trying to retrieve what they call the Great Tradition, which is a sort of manufactured term to describe maybe the most important conciliar common elements of the faith, like Trinity and Christology. That makes sense to me. I mean, it's one of the interesting things where you're like, what is the Great Tradition? And you can kind of, you can kind of flub your way through that because it's not a real thing. It's simply a term that recognizes by description some of the most important things Christians have done. You can just look at the past to, let's say, retrieve disagreeable ideas to be like an online, like, I know all the bad ideas kind of person to be cool. That's one method. You can retrieve the past in order to help your denomination understand its own roots. So you can look at Scottish Presbyterianism or something to help you think about how to be a Presbyterian today, or Baptist roots in England to understand how to be a Baptist today. You can retrieve for the sake of, let's say, understanding commonalities among Protestants or Catholics and Eastern Orthodox people, sort of an ecumenical retrieval. And then you can isolate also the differences as well. And maybe you find, okay, there's lots of things that unite us, some key things that divide us, have a clearer understanding of that, but you can at least maybe understand the areas where there's rapport. So retrieval is sort of locked into telos or purpose, like what you're attempting to do. Some people could just be pure historians and you're just retrieving the past for just, they love history. Like that just could be it. So for my part, when I think of retrieval, I'm thinking probably more in the category of retrieving the past as a Baptist to understand how Baptists are a renewal movement within Protestantism. What I mean by that is that Baptists in the 17th century, mid to early 17th century, viewed themselves explicitly alongside independents, Presbyterians, and Episcopal or Church of England churchmen as part of doing this sort of similar project, except with obviously being a Baptist, right? Like that key difference. But they wanted to show their similarities to their confessions and yet view themselves as a renewal movement from within. Well, that's pretty important to understand today, because when you understand your roots and the original impetus behind the movement, not that history is destiny, because things change, but it gives you added resources to say, oh, it doesn't have to be, one way or the highway. There's a richer, deeper, broader, more full tradition. And in particular, as a Baptist, if I view myself, which I think particular English Baptists should, as a renewal movement within Protestantism, then you also have access to what Protestantism has access to, namely, all the Christian past is yours. Yeah, there might be disagreements. Roman Catholics will disagree with many people in the past too, of course. Eastern Orthodox people will as well. But the difference is, I think, as a Protestant, a Baptist within Protestantism, all the past is yours. So you mentioned earlier about being a Baptist and doing retrieval when there's maybe a historical discord. And there's something to that, but there's also historical concord. Same view of the Trinity, same view of the Father, Son, Spirit, same view of the doctrine of God, same view of Christology, same view of redemption, same view of salvation, same view of heaven, same view of the resurrection, same view of the ascension, same view of the descent, same view of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So sometimes the differences can be maximized because they are obvious, and the things that actually are common can be minimized because they're not obvious sore points. So to summarize, the simple first answer was the past is really good to understand where the weight of Christianity is. And the more complicated second answer is retrieval it depends on the purpose of the retriever, what you're trying to do. For me as a Baptist, I'm trying to help other Baptists see themselves as a renewal movement within Protestantism, so they can say, all the gifts that God has crowned in the past are ours. And then there's more that I could say on that, but I think you need those gifts for today because wisdom is eternal. It doesn't change. And we are dealing with moral, ecclesial, and theological crises that require keen thinking. And we don't always have the resources available in our present decade. So we might need those people that the Holy Spirit has gifted to help us in these areas to work through them.
What are some of those particular crises you have in mind that we could apply this to?
Well, I think so those will all be controversial, so thank you for asking that question. There's a crisis in Trinitarian theology. As you mentioned, in the last few decades, people have attempted to find language that is better than the traditional language of Nicaea to describe what the Bible says about the Trinity. I think it's been unsuccessful. The eternal relations of authority and submission, namely that there's an eternal relationship between the Father and the Son that shows that they are one God, but distinguished through a relation of authority and submission. The Father has authority over the Son who submits. I don't think that works. It's that kind of stuff. There's also a crisis of, how shall I put this, identity. I think a lot of Baptists in 2025 are an amalgamation of Anabaptists, General Baptists, Particular Baptists, and fundamentalists. And the fundamentalists are winning. And so Baptists, while they are separatists by origin, are separatists with a healthy dollop of Catholicity that says, yeah, we're separatists because we don't want the state church controlling our worship. But we're not separating from Protestantism, not separating from the Catholic Church. We agree, for example, that John Owen or Thomas Goodwin, who are Baptist Baptists, they're like part of us, but we have keen distinctions. I think fundamentalism in Baptist circles that is excessively narrow is on the rise. I think that's a danger that will suffocate our movement. In fact, Baptists are on steep decline numerically right now. Baptistic people are not, by the way, lowercase Baptistic people like yourself. So there's something happening there, but I think Baptists are in that danger. I think there's also a danger of viewing yourself in a sort of a landmarkist way, where everyone else is bad. When Matthew Barrett became Anglican a few weeks ago, well, I don't know when he became, but announced it anyways a few weeks ago, Baptist people were called Anglicanism, like basically Roman Catholicism, bad on justification. And these are people who probably have strong convictions but no knowledge.
Haven't read the 39 Articles. Pretty Protestant there.
Cranmer's homily on justification. I mean, it's just Anglicans are one of the Protestant they're reformed. They're more reformed than Baptists are. So, in the historical definition. So, it's an uninformed opinion, but one that needs to be formed by wisdom. And wisdom requires reflection on the past and ideas that are eternal. Ideas that are eternal are not always contemporary. They can be 4,000 years old. Hence, Genesis is still relevant today, even though it's old. The book of Genesis is what I mean. So some of these crises are, yes, identity, fundamentalism, Trinity, stuff like that. I'm talking more and more to younger people who are considering converting out of Baptist churches to Orthodoxy, Catholicism, etc. It's increasingly more common. And most of the causes are like, I think I can give you one because no one's going to know who this is. It's just like, the guy told me that he was considering Orthodoxy, went to his Baptist elders, and they told him, well, the Orthodox are who John warned about in his letters to John, the Gnostics.
Oh, man.
I was like, oh, well, it's just uninformed and unhelpful, but spiritually not great.
Yeah.
Didn't really help me in that conversation because you don't want to necessarily go against the Baptists, but also it's a wrong opinion, not based on history. So I think this is a bit of a crisis of a lack of wisdom, a crisis of legalism to cover up the lack of wisdom. You need more rules when you don't have wisdom. And also a crisis of identity, which is statistically true, given that capital B Baptists are declining pretty rapidly. They used to be the evangelistic growers, and then you become Baptist and you move up to like Presbyterianism or whatever to get theology. But now the evangelistic growers are more or less Pentecostals, and Baptists are the disciplers. And you go through Baptist to Presbyterianism or Anglicanism to sort of upgrade in church history or theology. Is kind of the interesting pathway that some people take.
That's absolutely true. I mean, we joke about that. We're like, you get saved in like a Pentecostal church, you become a disciple in a Baptist church. Then you get your theological training in Presbyterian church, and you die in an Anglican church. And so it's a sort of life cycle. But I mean, you mentioned a little bit about the draw of some of the higher church forms to Baptists, and it is hard because when you say Baptist, do you mean like you're saying historically rooted, particular Baptist, or are you talking about more general, non-denominational Credo
I
Baptist,
was thinking
which would
capital
be
B Baptist when I was
yeah,
talking. I think there's lots of Baptistic people out there,
right,
and that number is probably going to increase and grow. I mean, that would include Pentecostal
yeah,
assemblies, would
yeah,
include all sorts of people. Baptistic's a bit different because you don't have this identity marker as a capital B Baptist. For me, when I talk about renewing Baptist life or renewing Baptist identity within Protestantism, I'm thinking particularly of particular English Baptists from the 1630s, 40s, and 50s,
yeah,
who are how I trace my sort of lineage. Although I have to admit, 400 years later, General Baptists were the sometimes called more Arminian Baptists. They became actually more Unitarian later. Anabaptists and other groups sort of all just amalgamated. It's hard to really
yeah,
tell who's who anymore. And that's fine. But of all those groups, the one that specifically saw, well, the General and particular Baptists in the 1600s saw themselves as Protestant. Anabaptists typically did not. Maybe the odd one did, but they typically did not. And they came from 16th century Europe. And then there are other groups that kind of pop up. I view myself part of the general more particular Baptist trajectory, which is usually just one way to distinguish them is that they had confessions that were affirmed by all the churches in the communion. So the London Baptist confessions in particular that were aimed to, the first one written in 1644 and I think redone, if memory serves, in 1640. Well, there's a few editions, but 1647 as well, was written during the Westminster Assembly, 1643 to 46, in order to say, we're just like you.
hmm,
And by 1647, Baptists were, unofficially tolerated. Before that, they were viewed as Anabaptist insurgents. But after this, people said they're somewhat reasonable. And as the interregnum period started with Oliver Cromwell and others, Baptists became increasingly part of Protestant life, part of the military service. Kiffin was a wealthy Londonite who probably helped to fund. I don't know if he literally funded Cromwell, but he had money to kind of fund this sort of stuff if people wanted him to. And they increasingly became part of this. There was a period of persecution after Cromwell, but in the 60s and 70s, I can't remember, but there's more toleration that comes short. No, it's going to be the 80s now that I'm talking out loud. It's not fresh in my mind, but roughly
that's
in
all
that
right.
decade. Then you have the Second London Baptist Confession, first written in 1677 and then kind of redone in 1689. All of which is aiming to show that we are Protestant. And that's really important for Catholicity. It's really important for unity in the Holy Spirit. It's really important to say, yes, we are peers with keen distinctions. And we think that our distinctions matter, namely believers' baptism. We wish that you are renewed and more like the New Testament in this area. But if you're a Presbyterian, Dutch Reformed, Anglican, etc., we're not viewing you as the enemy. We're just viewing you as a first cousin or whatever. You know what I mean? Or a
Right.
brother-in-law or something like that. Yeah, we have disagreements, but our unity is also important to recognize. Same moment.
Well, how does that work though? Because, and this is often the critique of picking and choosing in terms of retrieval, because you could have this Catholicity with regard to creedal statements, but it's not a Catholicity regarding the nature of one of the two sacraments and what a church is. I mean, ecclesiology and the sacraments, it is a historic deviation. And I think for me, that's the hardest, bullet to bite, where it's those are certainly, I think it's more important that you agree on the Trinity and Christology and all these types of things. But in what sense can Baptists or Baptistic folks, or however you want to, I know they're different, but who don't hold to a historic ecclesiology, or rather, their ecclesiology could be more historically novel. How do you claim Catholicity when there's such a deviation in terms of the nature of the church and then the sign that marks incorporation to the church?
Well, I think I would slightly reword your question. I think the nature of the church and the nature of baptism are not so. The deviation isn't so strong, at least in the nature of the church, Namely, it is all those who by faith become the body of Christ. I think Baptists, you can look at what is it, the British Baptist Union in 1648's confession statement on the definition of the church. I don't think you're going to find anything really in that is starkly different than any reformational definition of the church. I also think you have Baptists who believe that the only valid model is like this pure congregationalism, except you have many Baptists who have semi-presbyterial models. In fact, one of the key early Baptist thinkers, Knowles, Knollys, I think, but Knowles, I think is how you say it. He actually advocated for a single episcopacy over a city. The question on but there is one key thing that you're right on, and that is if someone's a Paedo-Baptist, baptized as a baby, and they want to join your church, most Baptists would say that you need to be rebaptized as a believer. So you're not accepting their baptism. Historically, that is an anomaly, and that's a serious problem, and it is weird. Historically weird. Don't mishear me. We have to reckon with that. I would suggest a couple of things on that. One is admit that it's weird historically. You're allowed to do that. The second is to think a little bit more historically and a little bit more on baptism itself. The view of baptism that Baptists have has various definitions, but you can still say that baptism is a sign and seal of the promise of God. A Baptist will say that it's a retrospective sign and seal, so you've believed first, so you're looking back on that faith. A Paedo-Baptist or Paedo-Baptist will say that it is a prospective view of the sign and seal. And so the nature of baptism is similar, although the timing is, of course, different. Also, different views of how you sort of enter the church and all that kind of stuff. But going back historically, I would probably also suggest that in the early church, what I find incredibly strange is that you have people who are both baptized as infants and adults very regularly. So all the famous guys are baptized as adults, like all the Augustines and the Cappadocians. I don't know if all of them, but many of them. And they're all baptized late for different reasons because they're afraid, blah, 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 of sin and all this kind of stuff. It's for different reasons. But what I find fascinating is you have this kind of dual practice seemingly going on, and everyone thinks that they're agreeing on the nature of baptism. So what's going on there? And I do think some of the debates that we have over the nature of baptism in our context are exasperated because of state churches and how baptism was recorded. And some of the debates that we have that feel very heightened are still a holdover through national church membership during the Reformation period. But I'm not sure that we're too far off, at least one valid way of thinking about baptism from the earliest church. Although admittedly, most early Christians believed in some form of baptismal regeneration, where Baptists typically really can't. Or if you do, it'd be very weird.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the weird thing where you read some of the early guys and you're like, okay, it seems like they have a strong Credo Baptist leaning, but then they have a very strong sense of regeneration as well. And then again, it's one of those things where you're like, well, you can't retrieve that but then it's like, well, why not? You know what?
Well, you retrieve it, but you don't have. So I think retrieving's not accepting. Retrieving's learning wisdom from the past to retrieve and think through how it might creatively apply today. Retrieving can't be repristination. It can't be just repeating the past. You can't just retrieve 1642 standards of like living in the Netherlands and a Dutch republic and think that's going to work today in a liberal democracy.
Right.
It can't be repristination. That's a big mistake people make. They just pull the past and say to repeat it, but it's like, well, that doesn't work. Like, it's not how that's meant to happen. But the wisdom there is for us today. It's the living faith of the dead by which we can help and learn and think through what we might be able to do. Baptismal regeneration is a very interesting one. I mean, obviously Titus 3 and other passages have in Acts as well, have language that really tie water baptism with spirit baptism. Arguably, most early people didn't really feel the need and the pressure to like distinguish those things like we do today, partly because of our polemics with Roman Catholicism that have been historically around for 500 years. We have a heightened sensitivity to it. But I imagine if I lived in 150 and I didn't have that heightened sensitivity, I would not be making the distinctions that I do today in order
Yeah.
to say we're not Roman Catholic, because I wouldn't have that polemical context. But a lot of the distinctions we make are because of polemical context, because of Arianism, for example, that affirmed that the Son was God, but not true God, united to the Father by will, not by nature, and the firstborn of all creation, and yet a creator on the side of the creature.
Yeah.
You have to then have these distinctions that are non-apparent to someone like Tertullian or Novatian, who lived before the Arian crises. In fact, Tertullian and Novatian, so Tertullian's around 200, Novatian a bit later, will say, look, in the Old Testament, the Son appears because the Son is more obviously visible in his distinguishable characteristic than the Father is more invisible. And then the Arians in 300 go, yeah, because one's visible and one's invisible by nature. Different nature. We agree.
Yeah.
Now, Tertullian and Novatian were trying to affirm the oneness of God, of course, but they didn't need to make that distinction because the danger wasn't present. And I think the same
Right.
thing's true with baptism regeneration, in part.
Yeah.
We're very sensitive and we very much pull apart spirit regeneration and water washing because we want to be on guard against the particular views that we reject or caution against. And I think part of that's an unfortunate annoyance because the Bible doesn't feel like it has to do that. Be baptized for the forgiveness of sins. We should be able to say, because it's biblical to say so. But the Bible also allows us to make these distinctions because it does, at a theoretical level, distinguish them. They're two different acts, spirit baptism and water baptism.
I remember reading More Than a Symbol by Stanley Fowler, and he has a very
Yes.
kind of sacramental
Yes.
view.
I think, so he's a friend of mine,
Oh,
Stan
okay.
Fowler, and Michael Haken. They're, you might say, like mentors to mine, to me in terms of being a Baptist. They're both sacramental, so is Charles Spurgeon. So we're, I think, virtually all particular early Baptists. There's probably some exception. They're all sacramental. There's no reason that you should not believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. There's no reason that you should deny that the water does something.
I'm kind of curious, going back to something you mentioned earlier, just you talked about your friend who was thinking about orthodoxy and I mean, what do you think is, and maybe this is getting to your point about identity, what do you think is the draw for Baptists toward a higher church type of aesthetic?
Well, I'm not fully sure. I think people often think the grass is greener on the other side. I think people think that the problems they perceive will be better if they move. I don't think that's true. But I do think that there is a sense in which a lot of people feel a bit burned out with Baptist worship that feels like choose your own adventure. You can do whatever you want. There's no accountability. There's nothing deeper than what's there on Sunday. That's part of it, I think. I think the internet has exposed us to many ideas and many differences and to deeper traditions out there, and we're curious. I help to run. That's the wrong way to put it. I participate, as I guess speak at it sometimes. What's it called? A service, an evening service for all sorts of churches, and it is a Baptist service, but we use basically a BCP type organization. There's no reason not to. Liturgy is good and beautiful. Baptists can do it too. But I think there's a generational difference as well. Older Gen X, younger baby boomers seem like on average a bit more casual than younger people and older people simultaneously, and are really linked into. I mean, part of this is like the hippie, 70s with all the hippies and everything.
Yeah.
And you don't want to wear a tie because it'll make people feel like they can't come in the building. You're like, really? Why is that even an argument? Like, wear a suit and tie. No one's going to care. No one cares about that stuff. But that's an argument you'll hear. So I think there's an informality, and that informality, I think, sometimes communicates a lack of seriousness to younger people who are used to professionalism or are used to people, taking themselves seriously through different modes that could be part of it. There are some real problems in Baptist churches. You go to 10 Baptist churches and ask the same question, you might get 10 different answers. I think you'll find that everywhere else, though. I think there's tons of reasons. I'm not sure. I think Matthew Barrett laid out a number of reasons in his Exit Substack. I don't partly agree with some of his stuff on the Trinity, but I don't fully agree with his his criticisms. I think everywhere you go, there are significant problems, and by God's grace, we are what we are. It does feel, I think, fulfilling and stabilizing to find a tradition like Eastern Orthodoxy that just says, we've been the same for 2,000 years, haven't changed. Your church has changed every year, new themes, new theology. Come to what is stable. Do something hard, because membership, I might say joining the Orthodox Church is hard compared to a Baptist church typically.
Mm-hmm.
Have high standards. Typically, moral standards in Orthodoxy are, on average, clearer and stronger, more strongly put than maybe a seeker-friendly model would have put it. And it's weird, and it's fine with being weird. I think that's attractive to young men in particular. All of those things. I think we like formality, we like clearness, we're fine with weirdness, and maybe that's a bit of a wake-up call to Baptists to have courage, to speak clearly, courageously, strongly on moral issues, to be okay being weird. You remember DC Talk? Well, people think if they find out that I'm a Jesus freak, well, just be a Jesus freak. It's totally fine. I think be odd, make membership hard in the sense that I'm describing, not like you can't get in, but like
Right.
hard, like there's real obligations when you join a church. Jesus is Lord of your life. You can't live this way anymore, like that kind of hardness. I think deeper thinking, deeper theology is more and more necessary as technique and technology is ascendant, because questions are no longer black and white. Questions around IVF, questions around assisted suicide, questions around AI futures, questions around AI safety, questions around wearables, questions around all sorts of things now require wisdom. There's not like a Bible verse that you can just slap onto every situation. So wisdom is working out the principles of faith today based on the past, based on scriptural revelation, and based on the God-given wisdom that we have. Massively important. Fundamentalism tends to want to replace wisdom with rules, and you become a fool through that, where I think real retrieval is attempting to distinguish what is clearly revealed and what requires wisdom to discern. And I think that allowing wisdom its place is massively important.
That is a very interesting point. You mentioned it before too, about when you lack wisdom, you make rules, and that fundamentalist aspect I haven't really considered too much. I mean, because it almost seems like that sort of, for lack of a better term, maybe a sectarian impulse. It's designed to maximize the distinction as a sign of faithfulness, whereas there seems to be, with retrieval, you're trying to maximize the continuity as a sign of Catholicity, and then that should actually be the main vein that you tap into. Because in my mind, when I think about Reformed Baptists, I do kind of tend to think about like a very sectarian kind of mentality, and
Well, one might say that Reformed Baptists are just rebranded fundamentalists, given that it's hard to be Reformed and a Baptist when historically those definitions were very concrete for historical communions. Better to say Reformational Baptist or Protestant Baptist, in my opinion. But I don't want to say you can't have rule. I mean, meaning wisdom can say that you should have patterns and habits and local church rules and membership policies. When I'm saying rules, I just think there's a there's a set of overreaches that do happen. Don't all the stereotypical stuff. Don't drink, don't chew, don't dance, and whatever, all that kind of stuff. There might be some wisdom there, by the way, situationally. Like I personally I drink a little bit. I don't really drink anymore, largely for health. I have, I have genetic heart issues and things in my family. There's just certain things that I shouldn't do.
Yeah.
But what I'm getting at is when you reduce wisdom to Bible verses, then whenever you get into a problem, you have to either make a square Bible verse fit into a circular situation, which often happens. You have a Bible verse ripped out of context and applied, or you go, maybe there's no Bible verse on brain surgery.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe actually what is mentioned in the Bible is self-control, slow reflection, wisdom. and that I'm going to interview a couple doctors, and based upon their character and their experience, that based on these biblical principles, I can maybe select the best doctor for the surgery. But no Bible verse. The Bible's insufficient, you might say, for brain surgery, but it's never meant to be. Like, that would be a silly
Right.
argument to make. I mean, I know it's over the top, but you hear what I'm trying to say. Where wisdom, I think, is allowing the Bible to speak clearly, and then allowing God's Spirit to work in your heart to, in light of the principles that Revelation gives you and nature gives you, to make good decisions based on so many things in life that there might be a circle situation. You have 5 square Bible verses. So wisdom creates a circle from those square Bible verses and fits through.
I'm thinking through, you mentioned earlier about retrieval as it's not repristination. I think that was the word you used. Or we're not trying to just copy and paste something from a prior time and just dump it into the 21st century. But for example, I hear like Roman Catholic critiques about, you know, can you actually, like I think about with Calvin quoting Augustine so many times in his Institutes. I mean, he draws a ton from Augustine, and in my mind, I'm always like, but he knows, right, that like Augustine, his soteriology does seem very different from his in terms of baptismal regeneration. He's got some stuff that he's got some odd types of views, and I guess it's that principle of sort of individualism where the modern Protestant, the modern Reformational Baptist looks down the corridors of time, and he just, with his own discernment, extracts Augustine's view of predestination apart from his ecclesiology, or extracts classic theism from, or extracts Aquinas's doctrine of God, but not his Mariology or something like that. And I think about that, where like, how do you square up to that critique?
Well, one helpful thing is to realize that Roman Catholics, who are going to make John Henry Newman the 38th Doctor likely very soon, have almost by definition accepted his view of the development of doctrine, which is a theory that says that the magisterium can pull new things out of old wineskins, as Vatican II notes in one of its documents. I can't remember how to pronounce it right now. And this seems to be a significant change from the earlier Catholic argument that Jesus gave unwritten tradition to the apostles, and through succession it was vouchsafed, but an admission that some things cannot be traced throughout the tradition and seem to kind of come out of nowhere. Not out of nowhere, that's too strong, out of somewhere. And this has to be the case now that history is so accessible. So in the 1800s, there's, I think, a commission given to look at all the church fathers, many of the church fathers, on the rock passage in Matthew's gospel.
Yeah.
And it was very unpopular at Vatican I to talk about, because it actually showed that not all the church fathers were unanimous that it meant the Pope. And then it kind of comes out in Vatican II era that now it's fine to talk like that. But there are a number of doctrines like transubstantiation, the Marian dogmas, and others that you really can't trace throughout all church history, or sometimes even if they're early, there's huge disagreement on it. And so this development idea will say that there are some things that are not clearly taught in the Bible, but have a continuity of principle from the Bible, like original sin. I think the Mary dogmas, transubstantiation, papal infallibility, and so on, which really in 1870, if memory, someone might correct me, I think the Vatican I is kind of when that's first clarified. So I would suggest strongly that the Roman Catholics have a lot of novel doctrines themselves, and arguably with John Henry Newman becoming a doctor of the church, they will more or less have to admit, but then wordsmith that admission to say that this is merely a development, not necessarily a newness.
Yeah.
Whereas when Calvin is writing Cardinal, was it Sadolotto? I can't remember exactly. He is attempting to say, and other reformers say, that we are trying to reform the church back to an earlier form, Christianity, that was, let's say, more pure, that pushes away these novelties. So, you can accuse Protestants of being individualistic, which maybe is more just a symptom of individualism in the 21st century than being Protestant, by the way. You can accuse Protestants of novelty, but I mean, I think the sword swings both ways. I'm always interested in the Orthodox Church. We talk to a priest, and they say it's never changed. And I go, yeah, except for the 75 ways it
Yeah,
changes
right.
every single month. Not month, every decade or whatever. I'm always interested to hear those sorts of arguments because historically now you just kind of know they're not fully accurate. So I don't think it's a Protestant problem. I think it's a Christian reality. What I would argue is, look, if transubstantiation was very popular between 1200 and 1500, a little bit earlier too, by the way, but 1200 and 1500, and the majority of people had it, that's not a powerful argument to me. Christians are wrong about all sorts of things for long periods of time. The most powerful argument to me is the Bible the norming norm, the final authority for life and practice? And I believe it is. And for that reason, I'm very comfortable saying Christians can be deeply wrong for centuries and the truth can be recovered. I don't think you're going to be wrong to the extent that there's no Christians anywhere. I mean, I think, like I said, Bernard of Clairvaux is ours, Thomas Aquinas is ours, etc. They're common possessions. They're all in heaven. Well, Jesus knows finally, but they're all in heaven. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, I don't think I need to say that everyone went to hell and after 100, in some like trail of blood theology thing. I don't have to go there. So I think that the blade swings both ways. I think individualism is a symptom of modernity. It's not really a symptom of being Protestant. Arguably, the early Protestants, through their confessionalism and associations across confessional nationalities, attempt to show you almost a suppression of individualism, if that makes sense.
Well, that's interesting you brought up Newman, because I remember hearing his theory of development, and I'm like, I mean, I guess you just take this and widen the scope beyond the Catholic Church. Isn't that just how it works? There's a seed of doctrine and controversy develops, and you have to clarify, and over time, the church comes to sort of an understanding, clarifies language, things of that nature.
Well, he's not necessarily saying clarification as much as he's saying it wasn't present in the Bible clearly.
Gotcha.
But the magisterium can still affirm it. And you have to, because of how clear historical documents are and how easy they are to access in the modern world. You now know that the idea that there's this unbroken tradition through the succession of bishops by Jesus doesn't appear to be historically accurate, because there's lots of differences or lots of dogmas, doctrines that were not present until much later in church history and unattested for earlier. So you need to be able to now account for this. And it strikes me that the trend with post-Vatican II and now this John Henry Newman doctrine as becoming a doctor is to say, yeah, kind of true. Hence, we need, I can't remember, Vatican II, they have a special Italian name for it. It's like a grazando or something like that. This idea of development. And, the spirits behind it and the magisterium's there. So, yeah, I'm not convinced. I think a lot of the phalanx of Roman Catholicism idea is not true. It's very diverse and its history is messy as all get out. And Protestantism's I think all Christianity is messy. Interestingly enough, of all true communions that remain Christian, pretty much though you still have the same agreement on the Father, Son, Spirit, Christ, and the Church. And I think there is something important to know, that there is a deep weight to Christianity. That weight is testified to in the Holy Scriptures. The reason why Christian communions all have to agree on this, finally, is because the Bible is about God and Christ and us, our salvation. Like, there's not really any way around the main storyline there. Hence, the Nicene Creed is pretty venerable because it's summing up the main topics of the faith. Namely, we believe in the Father, the maker of heaven and earth, the Son, who for us and for our salvation became man, the Holy Spirit, and then the church, the sort of four pieces of the Nicene Creed, which is the symbol of the faith as argued through the centuries and present in the baptismal formula and present in the regula fide and present in the New Testament itself. So, yeah, I'm not sure that critique I really buy. I just think everyone's messy.
Yeah.
I think Protestants and evangelicals like to beat up on themselves because it's like stylish and somehow humble. But no, we're right. They're wrong.
There you go.
I just don't. You can be be humble enough to be proven wrong. Don't mishear me. I'm not trying to say like a weird, But I get so like, why do you keep saying how bad? I mean, okay, so like whatever, there's tens of millions of evangelicals in the U.S.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are sinners, there are sex scandals, there are terrible counseling. I agree with all of that. Same in Rome, like the same
Yeah.
everywhere you go. Same in public schools, for goodness
Yeah.
sakes. Like, we shouldn't tolerate sin, but when sin happens, it doesn't mean that like you have to just like for 100 years talk about how terrible everything
Right.
is.
Right.
You can be right and have terrible sinners in your midst. I mean, First John is in the Bible, for goodness sake. You had a number of Christians who denied that Christ came in the flesh and then were left us because they were never part of us. In both Jude and Peter, you have a number of Christians that were sexual perverts and preyed on people. In First Corinthians, I think first or second, I can't remember which one's mentioned. And you have someone who's having sex with a relative. Like these are like, this is it.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the church. You can be as puritanical as you want, but recognize that the ark of salvation is full of saints and sinners who are becoming holy, I grant, but don't enter in morally perfect. It's the habits of growth and the work of the Holy Spirit that moves us from one level of glory to another.
Well said. Maybe, bringing this to a close, I mean, with Davenant Institute, what role are you hoping to play with Retrieval? What are some things you're excited about? I mean, it's a bunch of people from different denominations teaching classes, writing articles, gathering together, thinking together. What are some things you're specifically hoping for with regard to Davenant's role in Retrieval?
Well, my greatest interest is Christian discipleship and Christian spirituality. So I would say I have some significant differences with someone like a John Mark Comer, but what he is aiming to accomplish would be a common project. I simply think that the resources that we have in our Protestant and Christian past change the direction and how that spirituality looks like. So that would be something that would be keenly interesting for me. Right now, I'm teaching a class on Augustine's On the Trinity to kind of a big class. And one of the interesting things in that book is it's kind of the formal presentation for what Confessions says by spiritual autobiography. How does anyone come to know God? How do you work through the Old Testament to the New Testament, to the missions, to the processions, to the image of God that we are, then back to Him? How do you confess praise of God and have a vision of God in this life and in the next? So for me, that's hugely important. I think discipleship is probably the issue du jour right now. We all think it's politics. We all think that it's denominational fights and all this kind of stuff. But I at least in my context, I see discipleship and a sort of inability to understand right from wrong and morality and what it actually means to follow Jesus as being the thing. We need to be salt and light of this world. We need to be the light on a hill. We need to be working towards the common good. We need to activate and allow people to work with their hands and live quiet lives, as Paul says in 1 Thessalonians, and be dependent on no outsiders. We need to show people the goodness of the ordinary life that is virtuous and satisfying, promote what is good, true, and beautiful. And I do think this is the order of today. And I think the past Christianity shows how important this was to virtually every generation of Christianity. And I don't want to say it's unimportant today, but it seems like we're so sidetracked by, possibly just because the age that we live in, like digital technology and all kind of stuff, really makes us distractible creatures. But I'm deeply worried that we don't have a deep spirituality that seeks to know the triune God of Scripture in the face of Christ. So that's the kind of things that I'm personally most excited about. We're going to do lots of other sorts of projects at the Davenant Institute, political thought, talk about Reformation thought in general, broaden some of the things, give deeper insight, more options. But I think for me, that would be my sort of personal interest.
Well, I think that's a great interest to have, and that's what it boils down to. I mean, it's knowing God in Christ and the ways that we're formed and shaped, and the life of faithfulness that calls us to. And I think that there's a lot to be learned, a lot to be harvested from the past. But Wyatt, thank you so much. This was a great conversation. I'm going to put links to Davenant Institute and some of the classes that are going on. And I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please support the show and consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can find all the links to our YouTube channel and our Instagram account in the show notes. Thank you guys for joining us.